Good morning, boys and girls. Mrs. Thomas here. Hi. I am going to be reading chapter 2 in our Humphrey book today. Remember, the Humphrey book is called Trouble According to Humphrey. And Humphrey is a little, can you see what he is? Yep, he's a little hamster. And he lives in a classroom. He's a classroom pet. And his little friend next door in his cage is Og the frog. So inside the classroom, these kids have two class pets, Humphrey the hamster and Og the frog. We're going to find out how Humphrey gets on this train. That's going to be later in the book. So I read chapter 1 yesterday. If you want to listen to it, you can go back to yesterday. Today is Humphrey chapter 2, The Problem with Paul. Humphreyville wasn't the only new thing in room 26 that Tuesday. Once everyone was seated after recess, Mrs. Brisbane opened the door, and in walked a small boy I'd never seen before. He stood very straight and held his chin high. "Welcome, Paul," the teacher said. All of my classmates turned to stare at the boy, who stared right back at them. I craned my neck to get a look at him. All I could tell was that this Paul looked very, very serious. Class, some of you might know Paul Fletcher from Miss Loomis's class. He's going to be coming into our class for math every day from now on. He's a year behind us. That was Heidi Hopper, of course. Gail started to giggle, but stopped herself, although I'm pretty sure Paul noticed. His chin sagged for a second. "Heidi, please. Paul is an excellent math student, and Mr. Morales asked if he could sit in on our class." So we have a character here, Paul. He's one of the new kids that's just coming in for math. And then we met Mr. Morales. Do you remember who Mr. Morales was? Yep, he's the principal. He's like Mr. Hahn of their school. "I expect you to treat him like every other classmate and be as helpful as possible. Some of you probably already know Paul, don't you?" Mrs. Brisbane waited. Very slowly, Art raised his hand. "He lives across the street from me." Art kept doodling on a piece of paper. He was a great doodler. If I doodled as much as he did, I'd fill up my whole notebook in a day. Unlike Seth, who had a hard time sitting still, Art sat quietly, but his pencil was always moving. "Let's pull up a chair next to you. Here, Paul." Paul sat, though he and Art didn't look at each other. "Why don't we go around the room and introduce ourselves?" One by one, my classmates said their names. Gail giggled when she told her name. Richie mumbled, and Mrs. Brisbane had to say, Repeat it, please, Richie." AJ said his name extra loud, and Saya said, "I am Saya Nasiri. Welcome, Paul." That was nice. When they were finished, I squeaked out, "And I am Humphrey." Mrs. Brisbane laughed and said, "I guess Humphrey wants to make sure you meet him too. And Og, our frog, of course." Og silently stared out of his glass house. "Sometimes I wish he acted a little friendlier." Mrs. Brisbane quickly launched into math class with a difficult problem for us to work out. Everybody went to work except for me. I was too busy watching Paul. He was writing like crazy. Mrs. Brisbane walked around the room to see how much each student was working on the problem. "Good, Heidi. Make sure those numbers line up," she said. "That's perfect, Saya." She told AJ and Tabitha to try again. When she saw Paul's answer, she smiled and she said, "Excellent, Paul." When she saw Art's answer, she stopped smiling and said, "Needs work, Art. Try going back to that first step and starting over." I watched the two boys as the teacher did more explaining. Art hadn't done well with his problem, and he looked unhappy. Paul had done really well with his problem, but he looked unhappy too. At the end of all her explaining, Mrs. Brisbane told us that we'd have a test the next week and handed out a study sheet. "Eek!" I squeaked. I didn't mean to. I just realized that I'd been paying so much attention to Art and Paul that I hadn't listened to the teacher at all. You should always listen to your teacher. "Any questions?" she asked. Paul raised his hand and she called on him. "What is Humphreyville?" he asked. "It's our town that we're creating for social studies." "Oh," said Paul. "Well, if there are no questions, you may go." So Paul just coming in their class for math, and he's very good at math. Paul, we'll see you tomorrow. Mrs. Brisbane used her especially cheery voice. Paul didn't waste any time grabbing his notebook and hurrying out of room 26. I liked Paul, but I wasn't sure that he liked room 26 very much. By the next day, Humphreyville was taking shape. My fellow students had already begun to build their homes. Oh, there were so many different kinds. AJ made a house out of blocks. He didn't care if somebody knocked it over because he could build it up again. Garth made a log cabin. Seth's house was a spaceship. Cool. Golda Miranda drew a picture of Purple Castle. She deserves a castle. Heidi, true to her word, made a blue tent with pink and yellow polka dots. Saya built a tall apartment building. She said since Humphreyville would be such a popular place, we would need a lot of places for people to live. Mandy's house was very tall and narrow. She explained that each floor was for a different member of her family. Unfortunately, it kept tipping over. By far, the house that got the most attention was Art's. He used small plastic bricks, metal springs, sprockets, and things I don't know the names of to build a house that had a big slide coming out of the attic, inner rooms that revolved like a merry-go-round, and train tracks that went right through the middle. I believe Art's house will put Humphreyville on the map, Mrs. Brisbane said. I think he got the first A on that project that he had all year. I sure gave him an A. When Paul came into class for math, he sat next to Art, although they ignored each other completely. It sounds strange, but Paul looked even smaller when he walked out of room 26 than when he walked in. Think about that for a minute. Why would Paul look smaller when he walked in than when he walked out? Think about that for a minute. On Wednesday evening, I scribbled in my notebook, working on the drawing of my house. It got dark early. Luckily, I could sketch by the light of the street lamp outside the window. Of course, the sound of the crickets, Og's special treats, going chirp, chirp, sometimes made it hard to concentrate. Suddenly, I was blinded by the bright lights. Surprise, surprise, Aldo has arrived. My eyes adjusted to the light, and there was our friendly custodian, Aldo Amato. Bowing from the waist, I quickly slipped my notebook behind my mirror. So you know how at our school we have Mr. Tim, the janitor? Mr. Tim is always in the cafeteria with you guys, and you can see him mopping the floor in the hallways. That's Mr. Aldo in this book. And if you didn't remember from chapter 1, Humphrey in his cage, he has a little tiny notebook and a little tiny pencil that he hides behind his mirror. And when the teacher does spelling, he writes all of his spelling words on his notebook and he tries to study. Isn't that so cute? So Aldo comes in when he cleans the rooms and he squeaks and talks to Humphrey. Greetings, Aldo, I shouted. I knew it came out like squeak, 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 but Aldo always seemed to understand me. Hello, Humphrey. Howdy do, Og. Aldo pulled his cleaning cart into the room, took out his broom, and started sweeping. He stopped as soon as he started. Mamma mia, what's all this? He asked, looking around the room. Humphreyville, I squeaked loudly. Boing, shouted Og. I could see how surprised Aldo is. With good... next page. With good reason. Since the night before, the whole room had changed. Tables with all the students' homes lined the back of the room, and rows behind their seats had big signs on them with street names. My classmates had argued discussed what each street should be named. When Mrs. Brisbane suggested First Street, Second Street, and so forth, the students did not like that idea. Then she suggested naming the streets after presidents, but my friends weren't interested in that either. We want something that stands for us, Garth said. Names are things that we like. Now the growing town of Humphreyville had Soccer Street and Basketball Avenue and Video Game Way, Recess Lane, and Pizza Place and Taco Boulevard. Aldo's big black mustache bounced heartily as he laughed and looked around. Welcome to Humphreyville, a sign announced in big bright letters. The table where Og and I lived had some grassy material on it with a sign that read, Og the Frog Nature Preserve. I was glad they named something after Og, so he wouldn't be jealous. Jealousy feels bad, bad, bad. Aldo started sweeping in. I'm lucky I get to clean Mrs. Brisbane's room every night because I learned so much about being a teacher. He had just returned to college so he could teach school, which was an excellent idea. Humphreyville, he repeated again with a chuckle, looks like the perfect place to live. Aldo went about with his work, as usual, quickly and efficient way, then pulled a chair up near my cage and took out his lunch bag. He always took his dinner break with Og and me and talked about his life. He talked about his wife, Maria, who worked at the bakery and had a beautiful smile. Lately, he talked a lot about college. Whew, Humphrey, I knew that school wouldn't be easy, but it's getting harder all the time, he said. I'm lucky Maria is an understanding woman because I hardly have any free time. I haven't been bowling in weeks. Although I wasn't completely sure I knew what bowling was, I knew it was something Aldo enjoyed. He chewed his sandwich thoughtfully for a moment. Still, it will be worth it. I can be a teacher and work with kids and maybe have a house like one of these, he said, waving toward the back tables, like the one with the train tracks going through it. He reached in his sandwich and pulled out a piece of lettuce. Here's to your health, Humphrey. He pushed the lettuce into my cage. I squeaked a heartfelt thanks. Sorry I don't have something for you, Og, my man, he told my neighbor. You're a lot pickier than Humphrey. Picky? The frog eats crickets. Yeah, not nearly as appealing as the mealworms I enjoy. Aldo hurried out the door with his squeaky cart. Although I was sorry my friend didn't have time to go bowling, I was glad he was going to be a teacher, just like Mrs. Brisbane. I could hardly believe that when I first met Mrs. Brisbane, I didn't think she was a very nice person. In fact, I thought she was out to get me. Now she's one of my favorite humans, and I have a lot of favorite humans. During the next few days, my classmates worked hard, building up Humphreyville. Every day, Paul came in for math class. Although he sat next to me, Art, his neighbor, never even looked at him. Every day, Paul left the classroom in a big hurry. On Friday afternoon, it was time for Mrs. Brisbane to announce which student would be bringing me home for the weekend. It was always an exciting moment for my classmates and even more exciting for me. My whiskers wiggled wildly as I waited to find out where I'd be staying. Pick me, said Mandy, frantically waving her arm. You've never let me take Humphrey home. She was right. I'd been home with many of my friends, some of them even twice, but I've never gone home with Mandy. You haven't brought back the permission slip I sent home with you, said Mrs. Brisbane. Mandy let out a huge sigh and said, My folks have been busy. Well, tell them I'm waiting for their signature. Now I believe Seth is scheduled to take Humphrey home for this weekend. Sit still Seth Stevenson was so excited he jiggled his chair until it was actually tipped over. Luckily, he wasn't hurt. Try to stay calm, said Mrs. Brisbane. I will. I covered my mouth with my paws when I realized that she was talking to Seth. I made a mistake. After all, I'm only human. I mean, only a hamster, which is a very good thing. At the end of a chapter, there's always like a little bolded part here, and this is from their Humphrey newspaper. It says, no housing shortage in Humphreyville. Building boom keeps room 26 students hopping. Population swells as Paul Fletcher joins math class. The Humphreyville Herald. That's their fake newspaper for their fake community. So that was chapter 2 of Trouble According to Humphrey. There he is, his cute little nose. And I will be back later with chapter 3. Have a great day.